Hi guys, and welcome to this exclusive mixed media and watercolor painting tutorial. So for my mixed media pieces, I almost never rely only on watercolors. I absolutely love painting with watercolors because they are unique in the way they behave and they flow. These abstract patterns that emerge while using watercolors are very different from every other medium. So for example, I recently bought acrylic inks, which are amazing, and they also do very beautiful patterns, but they are very strong and not very forgivable. So even if watercolors are not super forgivable, and if you think if you make one mistake you totally screwed up, well, this is not really the case, because with watercolors the watercolors, they sink into the paper and they color the paper, but they don't lay a coat on it. While with acrylic inks, the more you use them and put them on the paper, the more they lay a thicker and thicker coat on it. So although they might have a similar look to watercolors and are very beautiful, and they also can behave in similar ways, they are not the same. So, and I try to explain this in the beginning because I wanted to show that the technique that I developed is definitely based on watercolors, and I wouldn't dismiss them. So the watercolors are a crucial part of these mixed media pieces, and I couldn't do them without watercolors. So if I would only, for example, draw them in color pencils, which in some parts of the paintings you almost don't see that there is a coat of watercolor beneath them, still there would be something missing, because the watercolors giving me the first underlaying coat of color in these pieces. For example, in the face, they are a base for the skin tones. They are not only a guide and like a preliminary drawing, but they also have those beautiful effects. So if I only wanted to have like everything colored a little bit and then paint with or draw with color pencils, I could, for example, use markers for it, or like the acrylic inks that I just talked about. But with watercolors, I also have these beautiful effects, and these effects are very chaotic and messy. So as you see in the painting, while I lay down all these colors, they are so sloppy. I don't stay in the contours and borders of the drawing. I just go over the drawing and don't fill out everything completely perfect, because I don't think this is what watercolors are for. I mean, every painter is different and likes to use the mediums as best as they fit to their taste and their style. And my style is that I absolutely love those textures and these abstract patterns. This is why I also love to combine so many different mediums in one piece, because every medium has their specific characteristics. And with watercolors, I have this looseness and this chaotic mess, which is so crucial to give the pieces a kind of surreal feel to them. So sometimes when I see works on the internet or just somewhere, I just encounter art and the pieces are too polished and too perfect, I can't really relate to them. I also sometimes do the mistake by myself and I paint them too polished and I don't let any abstract layers left, because I paint over all the abstractions, all the beautiful mess that occurred in the beginning of the painting. And I think this is a fault. I think in my, or at least my taste, it is that those abstractions and those distortions from the original photographic reference, they make the art looking unique and special and like an artwork, in my opinion. So if I would just copy something perfectly, I don't know, like the character of art just vanishes. And those abstractions, for me, they are like a mirror of maybe an alternate reality, that this where I'm looking at is something really, I don't know, surreal and beyond the reality we see every day. So, and this is like the introduction of my process here, and the next points which I will be talking about will be focused on the technique. And the first thing I want to talk about is the color values. And I think many of you know already, color values are how dark or how light a specific area of your painting is. And I think in this piece, the process is shown very beautifully to understand. So as you see the face emerges, you see that I already started with details while I'm painting the eyes and the nose and the lips, but the color values are still off. And the color values are crucial for your painting to look realistically. If you want to do that, you have to pay attention to these. And for me, and I've heard in other podcasts that I don't know if this is true, and but I think it is an interesting idea. So that sometimes women are better in seeing colors and painting with colors, but are not so good in color values. I don't know if this is true, but for me it was definitely true. So I think a year ago or 2 years ago, I wanted to paint eyes, and the eyes were they didn't really look like I wanted them, and they always looked flat. And when something looked flat, then your color values are off, and I couldn't kind of figure it out. And then I asked my boyfriend, and he said, well, your color values are off. You have to really pay attention to them. And since 2 years ago, I really try to force myself to get the color values right. Painting colors and finding good color schemes and palettes are not that difficult for me, and trying to get the right color as well. I can mix every shade of red or of green or of every color, but the color values sometimes they are really, really difficult for me to grasp. And for all of you who have the same difficulties as me, I can give you some tricks how to kind of overcome it. So the first one is what I don't use personally because I'm too lazy for it, but it does work really well, is that you take a picture of your painting, make it, for example, with your phone, then you make a filter on it and set it to black and white. And then if you are painting on a laptop, for example, you have to, or you can also print out your reference also in black and white. And then when you compare the photo you took of your picture in black and white to the reference you have in black and white, then you see immediately the color values which are off. And probably there will be areas that are off a lot of times. And the other technique is what I do, that as I said, I have my laptop next to my working place, and then I just take my artwork and put it next to the laptop and make the laptop in the reference on my screen the exact size as my artwork, which, because I'm painting relatively small, is easily possible for me. And then I'm stepping back from it, and then I just compare the two, and most of the times I see, oh my god, this looks so weird. It's too much lighter. Oftentimes with watercolors, my paintings are tending to be so light. When we stare at them while we're working on them, we don't realize it. But putting them next to the laptop and comparing them with a reference is super helpful. And another thing that you can do is, I'm kind of only do it when I'm already finished with the painting, but I recognize that it is even more helpful. So I'm using a scanner for most of my pieces. My pieces are letter size, a little bit bigger, and I have a scanner so I can scan them in very high resolution. And then I save them in the same folder where I have my reference, and then I can put them, 2 files, next to each other. And then, sometimes it is so eye-opening that I see how different my piece is looking from the reference. Sometimes it is great because my reference isn't that good, and sometimes my art looks better. But sometimes it's a reverse, and then I'm very frustrated, and I think, oh my god, I really had to compare it more and make it more realistic or pay more attention to the color values. And with watercolors especially, you and I, or probably every watercolor artist, tends to paint too light because we paint on a white paper, and all the coats that we lay or add as a watercolor artist are very, very thin and translucent. It is different from oil, because in oil you most of the time have a very thick and opaque coat, which then leads that you probably don't have any problems with that your oil paint is too light or there's too much white shining through. But with watercolors you have to work with the whites of your paper, and then it shines through, and most of the time we think, okay, everything looks fine because all the colors related to each other looks okay and great, but in reality it is way too light and not dark dark or not saturated enough compared to our reference. So this is what happens most of the time with my watercolor pieces. And this is why I press the matter so much, the issue that you really have to compare your drawing or your painting with your reference. If you want to paint it like the reference. If not, then you don't have to compare it that much, of course. So, and now how do I correct the color values when I see that I did them wrong? Well, with this technique, I'm whether adding another coat of watercolors or color pencils. So if I see, okay, the whole face is too light and I have to completely tint it 5 nuances darker, then I just add a coat of watercolor. And I recently really liked this wet and wet technique I learned from a German artist, Lauvan, I recently met, and I watched his videos, which were very helpful to me. And this technique is that you just use water or a light watercolor and fill out the complete area you want to have a gradient in or you want to have tint. For example, if I want to tint the area of a face, but I also want to have a gradient, I just place a coat of water all over the face. But I have to stay, of course, into the borders because otherwise my color would bleed out of the edges. And then I carefully place those drips of water and of color into my wet surface. Pay attention because the surface tends to dry very quickly depending on your room temperature. So here in the last days it was very, very hot, so I really had to use more water than usually, but it was totally possible. And then when I want to tint an area and I want to have a gradient, I just use, like for the skin tones, different shades of browns and of ochres and also of orange and red. I always have those colors in mind when I want to mix skin tones, and sometimes greens too. And I just dip my brush into all those color pans and mix a nice skin tone, and then I just slightly touch the surface of the area that I previously coated with water, and then it beautifully bleeds into the area. And this works perfectly. You don't get perfect gradients, but this is the reason why I use color pencils in the face. And I almost paint over the complete face with color pencils. But to have these underlying coat of watercolors really fills in the complete area. So if I would only use color pencils, I will always have the grain of the paper shining through my drawing. And I don't want that. I want to have a very, very smooth surface. In order to get that, I work so much with watercolors in combination with color pencils. And you see on the video how the face transforms from maybe firstly a very flat appearance to a more illustrative style, maybe comic-like, and then in the end it gets really realistic because I really paid attention to the color values. What I also do in addition to get a very smooth and realistic outcome is that I try to use more than the skin colors you might think of. So I ordered a bunch of color pencils which are very useful, different shades of browns and of flesh tones. But to get real skin, of course, you don't only have these colors. And what I do is that I use blues and greens, and then I just randomly place them on some spots on the face. So most of the times I see here is a shadow or there is a shadow, and then I add some blue there. So I don't mix or paint the exact color of the reference, because sometimes I have reference from magazines or fashion websites, and then they edited the photo so much that there are no natural skin colors left. And some of you ask me how I find those areas where I placed all those skin colors. In reality, I don't really find them. Sometimes I can see them in the reference, or I know that you can add a little bit purple under the eye and yellowish around the mouth, but sometimes you can just try it out and see if it works. And there's mostly nothing happens if you add blue into an area where you paint with skin tones before. Mostly it blends beautifully into the skin tones because our skins there's so much green and blue in it. I mean, you just have to look at your hand, for example, and then you see that all where you have like veins, it is a little bit blue, and there it is really juxtaposing blues and reds. So you can just add some blues and some greens and some purplish, bluish, pink tones in every area you paint skin and see if it works. A good start is that you start with shadows or with areas that look grayish. Especially when you have a grayish area, blue and greens fits very well. So just stare at your reference and see, okay, where are areas which are very gray and which don't have a high saturation, and on these areas try out to add a little bit of these blues and see if it worked, and see if your face or the skin that you paint looks better than before. I hope so. Let me know if you have any successes in this area. And the next thing that I do to get an extra realistic touch to my faces, there are some areas that have to have highlights. For example, there's a little line over the top lip. The line is always there, and I try to exaggerate this line. And pay attention, on this model, for example, the one side of the face is in the dark. So of course, the line on the other side is not really visible. So don't, if you add highlights like those little lines, don't paint those highlights in areas where you can't really see them. This would destroy the illusion of realism. And like I said, there is like a little line over the lip, which is white or light, and this blend into the top lip. And the trick to get realistic lips is to make the top and the bottom lip very smooth, so that they kind of bleed in a bit in the surrounding skin. So the more sharper the edges of the lips are, the less naturalistic they look, at least in my opinion. And of course, there's a little highlight on the bottom lip. Almost in every portrait I do, there is this highlight. There's also a highlight on the nose and some highlights in the white of the eyes. And the white of the eyes is also something that I struggled with, because I tended to paint them too white and then the eyes looked too flat, like I said in the beginning. So make sure you get the right color value in the white of the eyes as well. And also pay attention to where are the lightest places and spots on your portrait or on the thing that you're painting, and really try to detect where they are, and then you can place a slight highlight into these areas. And for the highlights, I use as a base my Luminance pencils, which are very oily color pencils from Caran d'Ache, and then I use white acrylics to add an extra dot of highlight. This definitely is my technique for highlights and for realism for the faces. And sometimes I think realistic faces are really beautiful when they are set in the right environment. So I personally don't really like to have a painting where everything is realistic. I'm not interested in that very much. I like when it is juxtaposed and submerged in abstract elements or in design elements. And with this painting, I think it is a very, sometimes I think some of my paintings are really successful. I don't have a great control over this whatsoever, but I decided to take this painting as an exclusive painting tutorial because I believe that this painting is successful as a whole, as a composition. I think it is good as a tutorial for you or for the beginning artists of you. Some of these elements, for example, are very design-like and stylized, like those flowers. And then they are juxtaposed with an area that is the complete opposite. For example, the flowers that are placed over the clothes that she wears, they are very light, whereas the clothes is very dark. So I think in a good composition you have a lot of these contrasts between your elements. Sometimes when I have not so much successful compositions, I oftentimes tend to place design elements like flowers or patterns, and they all are pretty much on the same level. So they might have the same color values, they might have the same amount of details, and this is not good. So you have to have a contrast in your paintings. This is very important. And also in addition, and I think this is the most difficult thing, is to have those contrasts working to get the focal point popping out the image. So as a bad example would be a portrait, for example, and you would place like a lot of details and they all have the same color values and they don't really draw your attention towards the portrait rather than draw your attention away from it. So in this case, it is not so. You see that you have some of the details, but they are not too detailed like the flowers, that they would draw the attention away. And also you have the dark of her dress or her shirt, and then you have the colorful Luna moth. And then the face in between, and behind the face you have this circular pattern. So everything works towards the face. So too. And to give you a bad example, so what I could have done badly would be that I could have painted the hair darker. In my reference, the hair was darker, but her face is already pretty dark, especially around the edges. So if I would have painted the face dark, the attention would have gone away, because darkest point and their focal point and the most detailed point is the face. So luckily I decided to not paint the hair, and I also didn't paint the background dark. So in my reference, like this pattern in the background, this Alphonse Mucha pattern, was dark too. But also, if I would have painted this dark, it would have drawn the attention away. So this is always like juggling for me. It is very, very difficult to grasp. Making a good composition for me is the most difficult part. Even if I draw in Photoshop and I place the things around, when I paint the painting, I kind of have the feeling that I have no control over it and no control if the composition is good. And I think this is natural, and I think one don't have to stress too much about it. Sometimes I get really frustrated if my works are bad, especially when I have an important show and I want to make a good painting and then my painting doesn't meet my expectations. But sometimes it is really like the Greeks, I believe it were the Greeks, that says you have no control whatsoever about the muse. The muse touches you sometimes and sometimes not. So I like this metaphor, I like this idea that we can do all the things on our side the best we can, but sometimes the muses are not with us. So with this painting I was lucky and the muse touched me, and with some paintings not so much. They might be good because I do everything I can, but sometimes they are not like as good as I wanted them to be. Yeah, so this was a little bit mystical, esoteric philosophy at the end to encourage you and to inspire you, and don't be too hard on yourself. Of course, don't be lazy and try to give your best, but sometimes we are lucky and sometimes we are not that lucky. So I hope this was helpful to you and it could give you some new insights in my technique. And if you have any questions, you can just ask me. And I hope you have a wonderful day, and I see you on the next one. Bye bye!